So like I said before, when you're trying to decide which app you use, you should probably look at client preference and accessibility and your own personal comfort and proficiency. So with client preference, it's important to ask yourself if you're using this app just because of the novelty of it, like, oh, there's this cool new app I just found. I want to use it, but do you want to use it or does your client want to use it? And even if they might not want to use it, you also want to ask if the client is even open to like using technology, or if this particular app could be beneficial to them. And after asking that and assessing for that, testing it out together is often a good way to just see if the client would prefer it, because you never know if you don't try.
Mhm.
And if it doesn't work, no harm, no foul. I remember when I first started learning, I guess I still am learning how to use Ableton, and there were a couple of teens that I was working with who just really enjoyed, beat making. And I was like, oh man, now I have Ableton, I can use it. So I brought it in, and I was just the worst guide ever, because I just like, I knew how to do maybe three things, but then they were getting frustrated because like they wanted it to do this other thing, but I didn't know how to do that yet.
Mm-hmm.
And so even though it was a great fit for this group, I personally just didn't have the skill set to help it, to support them and to make it, actually beneficial in that moment. So yeah.
And as you're saying that too, that really reminds me of, again, like drawing that parallel to it being an instrument and thinking about how we sort of have the responsibility to kind of like know also the potentials of the instrument, both as far as like where it could go, like possibilities it can open, and also just like where it could go, that we kind of want to contain and hold for a client too. Um, and yeah, it makes me think, I think a similar instance where I was using an app with a client, and I'm like, oh, this can absolutely do what we need it to do right now. And I think I made it happen, and then I had no idea what to do from that point. I'm like, I have not explored this enough, to go where you want to go next with it.
Yeah.
It kind of, shut down the whole flow of what we were doing in that moment. And yeah, I guess it just really makes me think too of the idea of you're bringing in this piece of technology, and how can we just get to know it well enough that it just opens up the flow instead of becoming like a barrier. Because I do think a lot of folks who are kind of not familiar with tech, I think they probably see it as a barrier, or something that gets in the way of music making, which it's, I think it's like totally the opposite when you really get in with it at that level, right?
Definitely. Yeah. And also with people who see tech as a barrier, from my experience of talking with other music therapists and music therapy students, it's not just like how to use it that's a barrier, but it's the fear of like this like expansive world of tech and like apps. And it's like Rebecca, you were saying earlier, there's like billions of apps. And so, but maybe millions, but it's just so much. So it can be scary because it's just a massive thing. But really, when you're using apps, like you don't have to know all of the apps, you just have to know maybe a few. And maybe just choose one or two that you think, one, you would be able to learn, but two, that would be beneficial in some way, and learn it on your own time and like use it within your creative process. And you don't have to bring it into session right away. Just bring it, once you feel comfortable, and also if your client needs it.
And I think one thing too that I'm also hoping will help people with the ease, because I just, in thinking about being overwhelmed with all of the choices that are out there, one thing that I can say, particularly with the music making apps, particularly things like Logic or Ableton or GarageBand, one of the nice things is that, yes, they're different. They offer different things, but overall, there are so many similarities.
Mm.
And the interfaces are similar enough, meaning that if you learn one of them, and let's say you have a client that already has a different program, already knows it really well. So I was thinking about this example when I was working at a rehab hospital, and I was working with a teen who had experienced a spinal cord injury, and they really loved Fruity Loops.
Mm.
And I'd heard about Fruity Loops, had never used it, but had enough experience with GarageBand. And I was like, oh, some of this interface is a little similar. I don't know exactly where like your loop function is,
Mm-hmm.
but I know it's got to be on here somewhere. So I think sometimes it's also encouraging people that if you can learn, particularly in that realm of apps, if you can get comfortable with one of them, if you have to use another app, because let's say a client only has that one, hopefully the learning curve then won't be quite as steep, because some of the functions will be similar, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think that also, like, for myself, I think part of what's so cool about apps now too is that they do model a lot of technology that also exists outside of the app world, like hardware and things like that. And I was super intimidated and scared to go out there and like buy a drum machine or buy a sampler, because I'm a guitarist, I'm a vocalist, I'm like, I have no idea what to do with this kind of thing, right? $3.99 app that like just all of those things came along, or came along my radar, right? It was probably longer, was there longer than I knew. And I mean, it's just totally like opened up my interest in it, I think like being less scared of it, like you said, being like really just open to the possibilities of what I can do with those types of technologies, right? And I just think it's really rad that they're essentially modeling like what are digital instruments now in apps on iPhone, iPad, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that kind of brings up the accessibility piece, because, monetarily, an app is cheaper than a huge piece of hardware.
I was going to say, one of the things that reminds me of, because I used this again a lot in the rehabilitation setting, was when you have clients who have limited mobility.
Mm-hmm.
So even when I was trying to address like regaining fine motor skills using a keyboard, even with a really touch sensitive keyboard, a lot of times it still wasn't enough of a depression for it to make a sound. Whereas being able to touch the keyboard on an app immediately was successful.
Mm.
I had some issues with the accidentally swiping, and it would swipe out of the app. So fortunately, they made a way to get around that.
Nice.
In the accessibility functions. But something like that made a huge difference for a lot of the clients that at least I worked with, so that they could still address their goals. And then once their fingers got strong enough, we transitioned to the real, the real keyboard, the physical keyboard.
The physical one. Yeah. Yeah. For me, in the setting I currently work with, it's with adults. So they're, one of their challenges is visually, like the screens are too small, for phones at least, are too small, and we don't have enough iPads for me to carry around. So we actually have a huge smart board in my music room, and so I'm able to project like Chrome Music Lab onto the board, and they can just use a smart pen and just play around with it. And so it just makes it just an easier interface for them to see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
and as far as Chrome Music Lab is concerned too, I think there's a function in there where you can sing a melody and it'll
Echo it back, yeah. Or
yeah,
like do something with it, yeah.
you can hit record, sing a melody, and then it turns into a xylophone part or something to that effect, right? And so that's really cool as far as accessibility is concerned. Just giving different access to different forms of expression, right? Whether it's tactile or through speech or things like that.
Yeah, so those are just things to consider with accessibility, like tactilely, how apps can be beneficial and visually. But also, again, when you're bringing apps, you want to also consider other aspects of client ability and client cognition, and um, just assess, whether this app is accessible enough for them. Is it too hard? Is it too easy? Are there different ways that that the app can be adapted, or the interface can be adapted for your client?
When you're talking about the accessibility of apps too, it also makes me think about sort of a tangential idea, but how live acoustic instruments rather and digital technology don't necessarily have to be these like two completely separate worlds either, right? If we're working in like recording, for example, or looping or whatever it might be, and maybe there's a ease of access to a certain acoustic instrument or something like that, that can be like really quickly integrated into part of a loop or altered to sound more like electronic based instrument or things like that. Personally, I really like kind of finding that fluidity between different ways of interacting with the music, with the app, and of course it's all about interaction with the client, right? And really finding ways to foster that relationship in that way.
Yeah, definitely.
And it opens up too just the range of possibility, because if you have some clients that do better with the physical instrument in front of them, because either it's a physical, literally like grounding instrument like a drum, or it helps them stay in one spot. For example, again, like a drum, you're going to be sitting in front of it, right? Maybe depending on what it is. But if you have a client, again, who might have more either limited physical mobility or other needs that it would be better suited for them to play an instrument electronically, you can still have both of those clients playing at the same time together. You have to adjust the volume aspect. That was usually the issue I ran into when I was trying to combine the physical instruments with the digital, just because I'd always have to make sure the volume was loud enough or have an external speaker that could amplify the sound on the same decibel level or enough to have it mix with the acoustic instrument. But yeah, it's just a lot of fun to think about just the range of additional possibilities now that we have.
Now that we have a billion apps.
And just one last thing that comes to mind for me as we're talking about this too is also, I think, allowing the clients to bridge some of this to their own self-care, their own continued whatever that lifestyle might look like outside of whatever setting we're working with them in. Again, thinking about the price-wise, the accessibility of these apps and things like that. Like, there's so many free apps out there. There's so many really affordable apps out there that, like, I'm thinking about SoundCloud in particular, rather Soundtrap in particular right now. And I just love this idea that you could do all this work with recording for a client and producing some sort of piece, but simultaneously you're really teaching them, in a sense, hey, you can continue this work for yourself if this is meaningful to you outside of here, right? This is something that we can hook this up on your phone, right? We can keep this going, or not keep it going in that way, but this is something they can keep going for themselves, perhaps after treatment. And I really like the yeah, the implications of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it becomes a resource that they can use for themselves. Yeah.
For our listeners who might be overwhelmed with 1 billion apps, Gabby, where could you possibly help take them next?
Well, we're going to have quite a few tutorials, and a couple of them by me are going to be about different ways you can find apps and get acquainted with them on your own time. And those will be just little short snippets with various apps that can be used in all different sorts of ways.